So I want to invite Dora and Mark to come on up here. Just want to let people know, appreciate Dr. McClellan joining us prior to lunchtime, and he has a very hard stop at 12:30. So we want to keep going, and we'll take advantage of our extended luncheon period. So I'm going to be very brief here and just introduce Dora Hughes, who's going to moderate this session. Dora is a senior medicine and health policy advisor in Sidley Austin's government strategies practice team. And in your bio, it tells me you provide strategic advice to clients across a wide range of issues, and basically it's everything you can think of in healthcare, from coverage and insurance side to device and drug research and approval processes and clinical trials. And so I'm just going to turn it over to you to keep us moving, and thank you both for doing this. Mark, thank you for threading the needle here. We will get you to your next piece on time, DC traffic willing. So thanks.
Thank you, Murray. I will admit I'm usually a bit of a long talker, but Murray has quite emphasized I will be a short talker today, so I'm just going to get right to it. I want to start by thanking Murray for inviting me to participate in the panel today. I think all of you agree we've just had an amazing set of discussions earlier. We've talked about that the problem of drug prices spans the brand, the generic, the specialty pharma industry. I think a stat that I saw pretty recently that I thought was very notable was that of the top 20 most commonly prescribed brand name drugs in Medicare Part D, the price of their drugs has increased on average 12% every year times the past 5 years, which is 10 times the rate of inflation. We've talked about that the American public is unhappy, with 80% saying that they believe drug prices are unreasonable. Our panel today is going to talk about the administration's efforts to respond. We're primarily going to focus on FDA as we've been charged, but given Mark's background, we might dabble a bit in CMS response as well. I think just to set the stage although President Trump has talked about drug prices from the campaign through the first year, certainly his discussion has increased fairly dramatically over the past month. Just 3 weeks ago, in the middle of an opioid-related event, he called Secretary Azar up to the stage and pointed out that FDA has approved more generic drug applications than ever in history, and noted the savings that will mean from increased competition. They also noted that they have changed the rules in some of the Medicare Part D programs so that seniors will pay less out of pocket. Perhaps most notable for many of us in DC is that they promised that there would be a whole slate of proposals released within the next month, so probably any day in the next couple of weeks. No details were released along with that, but I did note that President Trump said, "You'll be seeing drug prices falling very substantially, and it's going to be beautiful." So we're certainly closely monitoring that. And I would say then just even last week, Secretary Azar appointed a lead person for HHS's initiatives to lower drug prices, Daniel Best from CVS. And even in his opening statement, Daniel Best recognizes what President Trump and I and every American know: prescription drug prices are too high. So I think with that stage, I mean, there's certainly a lot of anticipation, and some are cautiously optimistic that we'll have a meaningful and comprehensive response. But I do think, and particularly given that this session is focused on FDA, that if you look over the past year, certainly Commissioner Gottlieb has been very active in this area. With FDA, they've approved over 1,000 generic drug applications, hoping to increase competition. He announced the drug competition plan, through which as an early step, they published a list of every drug that was off patent, off exclusivity, that would represent a prime target for a generic drug sponsor. They also said that they would expedite the review of generic drug applications for products for which there was limited competition. They are working with the U.S. Pharmacopoeia to update, modernize the drug standards for the generic industry. They're working with FTC. They're publishing patent information that dates in the Orange Book, whereas previously you had to call the agency to find out this information. I mean, certainly it would appear that Commissioner Gottlieb is all in on this issue in terms of, or particularly when it comes to increasing competition. I would have to say for for a number of us who've worked in this area, I mean, certainly this is a startling development. FDA has historically focused on safety and effectiveness, and so we're curious to see what ultimately where this will lead us and what the impact will be. We are so fortunate to have with us today Dr. Mark McClellan, who can help us make sense of all this and dive deep on some of the proposals, including some of what we've just heard about through earlier sessions this morning at a superficial level. Mark really needs no introduction, but I will say a few words. Mark McClellan, MD, PhD, is the Robert J. Margolis Professor of Business, Medicine, and Policy, and Director of the Margolis Center for Health Policy at Duke University. He is a physician economist who focuses on quality and value in healthcare, including payment reform, real-world evidence, drug and device innovation. He is a former administrator of CMS. He's a former administrator of FDA. He's just been at the vanguard of a number of major reforms in health policy. He's also previously served as a fellow, senior fellow at Brookings Institution, and a faculty member at Stanford University. So thank you. Welcome for joining us here.
Introduction. It's great to be here with you, and thanks to Murray and the Kaiser Institute for bringing us together today. And I need to turn on the mic. Thank you. Always the basics.
So this is supposed to be kind of a fireside chat, so it's like I'm going to sit down as opposed to pepper the questions. But I just want to say, after the election, as the drugs stock prices increased, I remember reading an editorial where you were cautioning, like, they might not breathe too big a sigh of relief. I still think drug prices is going to be an active issue. Is this all what you expected, just very generally, and are some of the proposals where the locus of action? I mean, what are your thoughts about all this?
It is what I expected. I mean, how can drug prices not be on the top of the policy agenda? It's on the top of mind for Americans who see more treatments available than ever before, but a lot of them seem out of reach. So not a surprise that it's on the agenda. What I think is surprising is how much attention there's been, particularly around, as you emphasize, the FDA side. Now, say that FDA has paid attention to at least issues that have direct pricing implications for a while. Back at my time there, we did a big expansion of the generic drug program to get rid of what was I guess historically speaking, a somewhat smaller backlog, and tried to take some additional steps through guidance and manufacturing assistance to speed up generic access with the goal of getting drug costs down. But I think the current FDA leadership has taken that to a new level, not in ways that are generally out of line with the mission of the agency. It is about approving safe and effective drugs, and people are right to say that cost is not part of that consideration, but his mission really is to protect and promote the health of Americans. And I think the idea of making sure its regulatory processes work well and its interactions with industry and the broader public work well to improve access to affordable medical treatments is a key part of that.
Yeah. So one of the issues that we've discussed in an area that Commissioner Gottlieb has spoken about, and a somewhat fiery presentation to AHEP, was about the rebate trap. Or I think he accused the payers, PBMs, manufacturers of rigging the drug rebate system. I think the word kabuki may have been used. Can you tell us more about what exactly is he talking about, and what in particular has that meant for biosimilar drug development? He very much paired the two in his comments.
Yeah, he did, and there have been some complaints from biosimilar manufacturers that they bring their product to market, and this is it's not as costly as developing a new biologic, but it is several $100 million in investment, because these are more complex than small molecule drugs. It does take a lot of effort to get to market, especially in these early days of biosimilars. And then they get to market and they're up against the originator drug on a formulary situation where the manufacturer is now giving a big rebate back to the PBM or the insurer to basically make that drug more attractive to beneficiaries. And we talked about this in the last panel. At the heart of it, we still have a very fee-for-service based payment system for drugs with a lot of negotiation going on. It's happening, as you heard from Fiona and others, kind of proportionally at every step in the distribution chain. I am not particularly surprised that brand manufacturers in this case have responded to the entry of a competitor by lowering by offering more rebates and kind of lowering the net price. It's kind of what you'd expect to happen, and there have been some complaints about it, I know, but the biosimilar early days market is probably not for the faint of heart. There is going to be competition to try to keep those patients. My guess is that manufacturers aren't going to be able to, the original manufacturers aren't going to be able to continue offering big rebates to intermediaries and other incentives to the extent that they will keep out competition in this in these markets. But it does mean that the entrants are maybe going to have to take some aggressive steps to get better formulary placement and to get to a market that really is working more competitively. I'm sure the FTC and others will watch for cases of predatory pricing, but again, the prices for the biosimilars are still kind of well above the the manufacturing cost because of those entry barriers that I talked about earlier. I think we're early days for this market. I would predict, you mentioned some of my predictions from last year, that over time, it may not happen overnight, but over time we're going to see a much bigger biosimilar market. It is going to have a significant impact on pricing, not just through getting the brand manufacturers to increase their rebates, but also by really bringing some more meaningful competition to this part of the market. And I think there are some more steps that FDA can and should do to encourage that.
Well, I'd love to hear more about that, because Commissioner Gottlieb has been saying, I'm going to do everything I can within my lane. And so what can FDA do about some of these issues, particularly when it gets to rebates?
We are early days for biosimilars. It's sort of like early days for generics in the 80s, except a lot more complicated because these are big molecules, and some concerns have been raised about how similar they really are to the brand product. And I think a key issue where FDA could help, I mentioned two. One is in the practical definition of exchangeability. Okay, we all know that these big molecules may have slightly different folding or slightly different manufacturing processes, and so they may not be exactly the same like a small molecule drug. Can FDA give more scientific guidance on just how similar you need to be for a high comfort level about exchangeability? That's what really drives the price competition. So far, they've talked about wanting to provide more guidance in this area, and I think Commissioner Gottlieb has talked about more steps being forthcoming here. I think that'll be very helpful in encouraging more competition. These molecules are not identical, but that's true even for the brand products. Their own manufacturing processes can change in subtle ways. Over time, there's a drift in what exactly constitutes the brand molecule, and some of that is just part of the intrinsic nature of making biologics. And we need exchangeability criteria that reflect that more clearly. And the second thing would be going along with that would be steps to make it more predictable, less costly, more efficient to get to market. I think Scott's talked about the cost of bringing a drug to market in the several $100 million range for biosimilars. I think that could come down. I think it will come down with more experience over time. The more predictable, the easier it is to get to market, the better understanding we have of how exchangeable drugs really are, the more competition you're going to have.
Right. Because then that will drive some of the substituting, particularly at the state level, which a number have mentioned.
Yeah, and just one more point at the state level. A number of states have passed sort of anti-exchangeability laws, and I think that is a concern for making this kind of competition work, making it harder, just as we saw with generic drugs a couple of decades ago, to make it harder for patients to get the price competition by shifting patients from one drug to another. So it's not just FDA issues here in terms of regulation.
Yeah. Another issue that's come up in a couple of the sessions is a bill, the CREATES Act, and that is a bill that's been introduced in the Senate by Senator Leahy, Grassley. It's been introduced in the House. I always noted whenever you see a Democrat and Congressman Mark Meadows on the same bill from the Freedom Caucus, I'm like, whoa, that's a true bipartisanship here. But with the seriousness, they're trying to address the issue of branded companies, not all, but some branded companies blocking access to samples that generic sponsors need for their FDA approval studies. Can you explain that a little bit more? What exactly is going on here? In particular, how does that intersect with the REMS issue? And again, what can you expect from FDA?
It does intersect. So now we're kind of shifting gears a bit to small molecule drugs. So the traditional generics, although some of the same issues may come up because of restrictions on distribution and similar safety concerns with the biosimilar drugs. So what the REMS programs do is require manufacturers to restrict access to drugs. And what some manufacturers have done is use that as a mechanism for telling the potential generic entrants that they can't get a reliable sample of their product because of the REMS program. And that is clearly not what REMS was intended to do. And so the law would clarify that this is sharing these samples is a safe use and create what it intends to be a quicker legal pathway than what companies have to go through to get today in terms of major litigation potentially to get access to those samples. There are a few other provisions in the CREATES Act that I think would potentially help as well, and I think it's right to be putting some attention on how to get the access to drug samples to the potential competitors. That is a key part of demonstrating that your product is equivalent. It's not just REMS, though. It's also issues related to restricted distribution systems, and would just emphasize that, drug manufacturing and distribution is complicated. Who knew? But these programs are there for a reason. There are reasons that we don't, that we have REMS for opioid drugs, for many other drugs, because they do have real safety issues, and many of these REMS are significant programs. I think in addition to making these legal clarifications, FDA is also trying to take steps to make REMS simpler. So we've got now much better electronic data tracking technologies. We've talked about moving to even a national e-prescribing system for opioids. These approaches, which do not need to be linked to a particular manufacturer, may also be a way of getting around some of these sample access barriers.
And do you think, does FDA need new authority from the Congress as part of the CREATES Act, or can they start to move forward on some of this?
I think FDA is moving forward. FTC has been involved in this to some extent, and companies have brought litigation, but litigation and these regulatory steps can be costly and time-consuming. So if, as Commissioner Gottlieb put it, if the shenanigans are continuing, I think there will be some more pressure for legislation like this.
I see. And one thing I read in the press, which I found fascinating, was that Commissioner Gottlieb said, well, he's exploring the possibility of generic drug companies being able to buy these samples from Europe. And is that something that he could do? And of course, that brings in the whole. I don't want to take this too far, but I'm like,
drug importation.
I didn't want to say it, but that's exactly. I'm like, what?
Yeah, I mean, it is. So I've been on record as
could he do this, and would he do this? Those are two questions. So
let's go to importation, and but I've been on record as with every former FDA commissioner in saying that this is just not a good way to get safe, reliable, and affordable medications to people. One of the things that was included in the recent budget legislation with bipartisan support is actually more resources for FDA to inspect products coming in from overseas that contain drugs. There are a lot of them. Even with the expanded authority, FDA can only inspect a tiny fraction, and what they are finding is far from safe. And if you encourage a channel like that, you're going to get products that are at best ineffective when there are more effective alternatives available, and potential risks as well. But that really is the case for brand name products, and that's because because this importation would be happening independent of and against the desired distribution channels of the manufacturer. That's not the case for generic drugs. So for generic drugs, if there were an easier path to get from Europe to the United States, I think the manufacturer would probably welcome it. I mean, that's a bigger market. So I think it's an interesting issue that Commissioner Gottlieb has raised, but wonder if people want to think about maybe even some more interesting steps in terms of the generic market. We are trying to move towards regulatory harmonization with Europe, Israel, Japan, increasing part of the world. I think getting to standard and high-level regulatory approaches is beneficial for everybody in an increasingly global world, and a more globally competitive generic market would be really beneficial for Americans. So not just from the standpoint of samples, but from the standpoint of creating a larger potential demand for many of the generic products where we're continuing to have problems with access today, with small markets or complex generics where there's only one entrant. Having a bigger, more global market for generics could be really helpful. So I think that's an area worth exploring. I just really distinguish it from issues with importation and collaboration with products coming from outside the U.S. for brand name drugs.
Yeah. I would note that even Commissioner Hamburg, I mean, this was a bipartisan concern, had concerns with drug importation.
Yeah,
Remind
Caliph,
me,
all of them.
Remind me, how many generics do you need to see or before the price starts to increase? Is it generally having 2, or once you hit 3?
Well, 2 helps. 3 or more is good.
It's generally when you start to see.
And then there, as we were talking about earlier, maybe we'll have time to get to, is issues with transparency and other rebates or proportional, costs coming out elsewhere in the system. But at least 3 would be, I think, consider a more healthy generic market. And that's hard for smaller markets or markets that have, combination generic products or kind of more costs and barriers to entry as a result.
Okay. Another issue that just picking up on the last panel, obviously or even the other panels, we've been talking about the value of drugs, and I mean, I would love to hear your thoughts generally in terms of some of the new value outcomes-based arrangements between insurers, payers, and manufacturers. But then also because again, we're sticking somewhat to the FDA lane. I would like to hear one of the issues that you hear manufacturers saying, well, part of the reason we can't enter into more of these outcomes-based arrangements is that we have to be very careful what we communicate that may not explicitly be on our label. For example, if we think it could reduce hospitalizations, if that's not in the label, we could get into trouble. We know that in the 21st Century Cures Act, they expanded upon FDAMA 114, which allows some healthcare economic information to be shared.
But there are some more issues, especially, as you said, with claims or evidence that's not part of a labeled indication. Yeah. I think that's still an issue and is something that I know FDA is trying to work through in an era when there is a lot more contracting going on that's related to value. And we do a lot of work on this at Duke Margolis, so just a little brief plug for our value-based payment consortium for those who are interested in this topic. Like other things in drug pricing, it's complicated, but there's some fundamental reasons to move away from what we're doing now. Volume-based payment hasn't worked very well in the rest of healthcare, and it's a particularly bad fit in many, and increasingly bad fit in many areas of prescription drug use and biologics. But the indication-specific pricing often involves evidence for indications that aren't fully labeled. Much of the value-based or outcome-based discussions that we hear about, where people are trying to make contracts much more significantly dependent on results in a population and move away from paying for the volume of drugs to something more like a per member per month, or like a we're talking about subscriptions in the last panel. So we have a bad fee-for-service prescription now. I mean, wouldn't you like a subscription where you get the drug you need for a much more predictable out-of-pocket or total cost? There are ways to try to get there, but these are they do require much more use of evidence that may not even be developed yet. That may be something you need to do in the course of providing coverage. I think FDA will continue to look at these issues, though, especially as we see more significant shifts in drug payments in this direction.
And even though, and what do you think from the CMS side, and looking at these same issues, the value-based arrangements, or how can they facilitate these?
Well, so CMS. So one of the issues that has been raised is CMS rules about Medicaid best price, and I think for a lot of the contracts that we've seen so far in value-based payment, it really doesn't matter that much. A lot of them are pretty small, at least on average, impacts on pricing. For those of you here who have paid a lot of attention to value-based payment in other parts of the healthcare system, there we've had some, real concerns. On the one hand, lots of evidence that paying fee-for-service doesn't work. We're here at Kaiser, so good point to emphasize in terms of getting the right treatments, the right patients, and customizing care and putting the right services together, even if they're not traditionally paid for very well. Same thing is true for what's going on now, I think, in some of the value-based payment contracts, that most of them are pretty modest shifts away from fee-for-service, with most of the payments still dependent on a traditional, volume-based payment arrangement. Those I see less of a need to really worry about disrupting Medicaid best price, maybe a regulatory clarification that, hey, the best price is based on the average price that's paid for the drug, and this, if there's like a small number of cases where there's zero payment because the drug didn't work in a rare occasion, that seems like an easy way to address it. The bigger concern may be in cases where there really can be a substantial shift away from fee-for-service. And there it's not only the CMS Medicaid best price rules, but also rules like anti-kickback, Stark laws, as well as the FDA communications issues that we talked about earlier. All of those regulations are in place for very good reasons, that in a volume-based system, for both providers and drug manufacturers, you have a tendency to focus on using more services and more products, not on getting the best outcomes for patients. But as we are seriously shifting away from those volume-based payments, say for oncologists and the care that they provide, we've seen some instances of relaxing things like the Stark and anti-kickback rule. So, for example, a hospital could work with a provider in new ways, or with an insurer, and share information to target treatments more effectively. They need to do the same thing to bring drugs into that. I think that the goal is to get to incentives for manufacturers and providers that are much better aligned around the best outcomes for patients, not that are aligned as much of drug manufacturing, or much as drug marketing today is about getting volume up. The manufacturers are really good at that. I'd like to see that shifted more in the direction of working with providers on adherence, on solving problems like for patients with cardiovascular disease today, half of patients with hypertension and close to that many with high lipid levels don't have them under control, even though we have effective treatments, mostly generic, but also in some cases brand name drugs are needed. The current models are just not working for these populations, not to mention all the people are having to pay out of pocket.
So I'm going to give, I'm going to ask one last question, and so if you have a question after that, I'd encourage you to start thinking about that. I just want to very briefly talk about CMMI. I mean, CMMI certainly was very much maligned by Republicans in the last Congress, and I think former Secretary Price was no big fan either, but Secretary Azar has signaled that he thinks has value. He's not as concerned about mandatory demonstrations. I mean, where do you see CMI going
I think that's another area where you're going to see some very interesting developments going forward. Not only has Secretary Azar highlighted both drug pricing and getting to value-based care through more meaningful payment reforms, including potentially mandatory ones, as two of his top priorities. But there's a new CMMI director who should be starting soon, hopefully very soon, Adam Bowler, who comes from extensive experience in dealing with some of the most complex patients under real payment reform arrangements, under something like capitation, to enable them to get care at home, to enable them to get access to the medications they need, all at lower cost. So it's, I think, some new steps coming. Now, like your announcements about drugs, you said you haven't actually seen the announcements on Comm yet, but some of the directions that seem clear are maybe number one to this point about consumers having to pay a lot is getting patients, consumers, much more engaged in value-based care and shared savings arrangements. So right now, there's really only one, maybe two CMMI initiatives where the payment reforms and the shared savings involve the consumers, and that's some value-based insurance designs and in Medicare Advantage. All the rest are all about sharing savings with the providers. And you need patients to engage in these models. If you've got cancer and your oncology care practice is setting up extended office hours and opportunities for you to get a care plan in place and less costly ways for you to get your cancer managed, more effective use of the best evidence-based therapies, some financial support for engaging in all of that rather than having to pay just the maximum out of pocket, no matter what you do, seems like a big missed opportunity. So I think you'll see more efforts in the new CMMI to emphasize that as one potential new direction.
Okay. That's your crystal ball. See, hopefully we can talk in another 6 months or so and see if that's realized. Do we have any questions right now? Please go to the microphones if you do.
Doesn't have to be on FDA issues too, right?
No. That's we're quite fortunate to have.
Hi, Jim Wilkins, Fair Access Medicines. I have a particular question about biologics, about biosimilars, particularly with regard to insulin. So there have been a couple of biosimilar insulins introduced. You're probably aware that Lilly introduced a glargine biosimilar and is selling it now. And then Merck recently also has produced a biosimilar of glargine and got sued by Sanofi, actually, and delayed market entry by about a year. The question I have, though, is about the process that those molecules went through in clinical trials. Both of those molecules went through 2 500-patient phase 3 trials. And the question is, why is FDA requiring this? And if they're doing so, why? This molecule has been on the market for over a decade. And why? Insulin is a very simple biologic. It's basically a small molecule. It's a hormone. So the question is, that drives the price up, way up, for people who want to get into biosimilar.
Entry of other competitors.
Exactly.
Yeah, and I think FDA is looking for the right balance there. I mentioned earlier that FDA has said that more guidance is forthcoming and that they do think there are ways to bring down the cost of entry for many biosimilars. And you're right, insulin's relatively easy. I'd still say it's not quite so simple as a truly small molecule drug, but that is a great example of where more clarity from FDA about what exactly is required could potentially open up more biosimilar competition. So I think my impression is that, another prediction, there will be more clarity coming from FDA to try to reduce the extent to which manufacturers feel like they have to do costly studies in order to enter the market.
Yeah, because manufacturing costs
sorry,
are...
I got the sign from Joy that...
Just a comment, though. Manufacturing costs are a very small fraction of producing these drugs.
Yeah, once they're produced, once they're approved.
So absolute final, unfortunately, a somewhat brief question from
It's also about drug approval. It's a slightly different angle. You must have looked at the two new neuromuscular drugs that came out. One is Exondys and Spinraza, priced at $750,000. The first one had 12 children in the study. 2 got worse, 2 died, 4 had no change, and the drug got approved. Spinraza was tested in patients who are aged 2 to 15, 40% had improvement. At the last minute, they put in an indication for adult patients. And as you know, our Medicaid and Medicare programs have to give all of the drugs that are FDA approved.
Yeah.
And again, without any clinical evidence. And so we're now stuck with patients asking for these without any research to back that up. What do you think about that approval process?
I mean, this is a tough challenge and one we're going to increasingly face. First, let me say some really nice things about Steve Pearson, the work that ICER is doing to try to get everybody together to interpret and put together the evidence and reach a conclusion about what we know based on the evidence available. That is going up against the fact that we don't have all the evidence that we'd like, to your point, and for good reasons. Patients, parents might think that these drugs would benefit their children. I think where we're inevitably headed is towards more coverage that focuses on developing more evidence at the same time that coverage is in place. So, whether it's through the outcomes-based contracts that I was talking about before, we only will pay if we can reliably confirm that there's a benefit in place, not always easy to do, or through versions of what has in the past been called a program that we tried to expand at CMS, coverage with evidence development, where coverage is provided maybe at a somewhat lower payment rate in the context of conducting further trials in the relevant, or further trials, or at least collecting more evidence in these populations. It's really hard to do randomized studies in rare conditions like this, so we need to get creative about using and developing real-world evidence, but that's something that I think would be a nice, as I've talked about with Steve, would be a nice complement to the ICER work, identifying the biggest areas where there are unresolved questions and coming up with a real plan that's built into reimbursement for addressing it and, as best as possible, confirming whether the benefits are really there.
So with that, please help me thank Dr. McClellan for joining us. Thank you so much. So I know you have to dash. So if you need to step, I'm charged to announce that lunch is served in the back of the room. I'm also charged to point out that you have exactly until 1:30 to be back in your seats so that we can start. And so please. And the final point is, they're hoping that in terms of lunch that you have a chance to network and meet other people, and we can continue this conversation. So thank you very much.